Kaffir Boy is an autobiographical novel written by Mark Mathabane. The work is set in South Africa during the time of apartheid, otherwise defined as the separation of white people and black people in terms of equality. Mark is born into an impoverished family, and he lives with his mother, father, and growing number of siblings. His mother is typically his biggest supporter, while his father is often his biggest critic. The adversity Mark faces in terms of apartheid is what restrains him initially, but eventually pushes him to reach his seemingly impossible goals. Certain events in Mark's life prove significant in terms of his escape of apartheid. A major turning point in his life is when his mother forces him to attend school. Mark says, "What?" I gasped, leaping from the chair where I was sitting as if it were made of hot lead. "I am not going to school." I blurted out and raced toward the kitchen door. Due to stories he has heard through gang members and people who fear school, he has developed the impression that school is harmful and he should fight to avoid it. Mark, however, learns to love school. With hard work and continuing support from his mother, Mark is quickly the smartest pupil in his school, and eventually his hard work is rewarded. Another turning point in Mark's life is when he is awarded a scholarship to continue his education. Mark says, "Everybody clapped. I was at a loss for words. The principal rescued me by saying, with effusive pride, 'Johannes, I am proud to inform you that you've been awarded, based on your academic record, a government scholarship to pay for your schooling for each of the 3 years of secondary school.' I could not believe my ears. I did not know whether to jump up and down or cry." This scholarship is the culmination of Mark's efforts. This money allows him to continue learning and gaining an education, the key to entering the world outside of his home. The other significant event in this work is the introduction of Mark to the sport of tennis. Mark says, "When Mrs. Smith gave me an old wood tennis racket one Saturday after I had done what she called a splendid job in cleaning her silver and brassware and shining Mr. Smith's half a dozen pair of shoes, I was already beginning to get bored with soccer. 'Practice hard,' she said, 'for one day I want to read about you in the papers, as our next Arthur Ashe.' 'I don't know if I could be like him, madam,' I said, apologetically. 'He's good. I had been reading about Arthur Ashe's exploit in the old tennis magazines Mrs. Smith regularly gave me. I couldn't even begin to imagine how a black man could become so good in a sport dominated by whites.' When Mark is handed this racket, he begins to have a real goal for his future, and he has hope. Hope is something that leads Mark to push himself to succeed." The central theme of this work is that when intrinsic drive is ignited by an outside source, it can be a powerful force. Throughout the work, Mark is given support by two main figures, his mother and Mrs. Smith. His mother supports him in his early life. A prime occurrence of this can be seen when Mark's mother forces him to attend school. While at first he is reluctant to oblige, he eventually realizes that school is his way to escape the life he has always dreamed of escaping. Mark says, "That night, my mother, upon hearing the news that I had come out number 1 in my class, hugged and kissed me so many times and made me so many promises. Before the night was over, the yard was buzzing with news of a teacher to be at the Mathabanes household. Granny was told the good news, and she promised me many things. I felt happy and proud. I even began to like school. What was so remarkable about my first-year performance was that I had come out number 1 despite chronically lacking books, having had to resort to paying more attention during class lectures, borrowing other children's books to do homework, and relying on a picture book memory during exams. Even though some of his peers were at an advantage in terms of books or funds, Mark was at an advantage in terms of support. His mother would give anything to see him attend school and have a chance that she was not granted." Currently in France, there is a division between Islamic people and the rest of the French population. Similarly to apartheid, this division is causing a gap between the two groups' cultures and their lives. This division causes a stigma between the two groups. France is worried about these communities sparking violence. The Economist says, he argued that France, which bans the collection of ethnic statistics, should face up to the de facto segregation in its suburbs. He is especially worried by the connection between criminality, armed gangs and drug dealing, and jihadism. When Mark is growing up, his neighborhood is also familiar with crime and gangs. Mark says, "Tsotsis were Alexandra's legendary gangsters. In both situations, a separation of groups of people causes violence to commence. In both South Africa and France, riots and protests against police rule have occurred." The Economist says, in the summer of 2013, riots broke out after a man violently resisted a police check on his wife, who was wearing a face-covering veil, which is banned in public in secular France. Likewise in South Africa, Mark says, policemen with riot gear, rifles, tear gas canisters, and jambox poured out of the trucks and formed a phalanx across the wide street. As in Soweto, most of them were black. From one of the trucks, the husky voice of a white man suddenly boomed through a megaphone, "Disperse and return to your homes and schools, or will be forced to use force." A few students started turning back, but the majority stood and waited, chanting defiantly with fists raised in the Black Power salute. Similarly to protests, adversity can turn people violent. The Economist interviewed a man who said, "I love France," he says, but he worried about youngsters who become radicalized through rejection. In South Africa, putting an end to apartheid is what led to violence. Marx says, the doctrine of nonviolence, of passive resistance, couldn't work against the Boers. To be free, we had to fight the white man, shed his blood, vanquish him on the battlefield. In both cases, violence seems like the path that the government has forced the adverse communities upon. In hopes of no longer feeling like an outcast, these people fight for equal or greater rights, though with methods that are not ideal.